Chapter 2. A Journey in Time. Join me in a time machine. I've set it to take us back to the peak of the last ice age, 21,000 years ago, and to bring us, on a midsummer's day, to the amazing, mysterious and atmospheric location where the Great Serpent Mound National Historic Landmark can now be found. Of course, there was no National Historic Landmark, no such entity as the United States of America, and no Adams County in the very different world of 21,000 years ago. At that time, from roughly the Ohio and Missouri rivers northward, a wide horizontal strip of the United States and all of Canada as far as the Arctic Ocean lay beneath a giant shroud of ice. At no point, however, even at the last glacial maximum 21,000 years ago, did the ice ever advance quite far enough to the south to bury the sinuous natural ridge on which Serpent Mound stands today. We'll get to the question of when the great effigy itself was first heaped up in the form of a serpent, but for now, let's step out of our time machine onto that serpentine ridge and breathe the crisp, fresh air under the blue midsummer skies of an unpolluted world. We might see some of the great beasts of the North American Ice Age, the famed megafauna, such as mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, short-faced bears, and saber-toothed tigers. They thrived at the last glacial maximum, and would continue to do so for several more millennia, until they were all swept from the earth between roughly 12,800 and 11,600 years ago in what is known as the Late Pleistocene Extinction Event. The creatures I've named were by no means its only casualties. Altogether, 35 genera of North American megafauna, with each genus consisting of several species, were wiped out during this enigmatic cataclysm that brought the Ice Age to an end. But all that was still far in the future 21,000 years ago, and we're not at Serpent Mound for the megafauna. Instead, I want you to shade your eyes and look to the horizon approximately a dozen miles to your north. There, armored in brilliant, scintillating, dazzling reflections, a spectacle awaits you the like of which exists nowhere in the world today outside of Antarctica. That sight, a sheer, looming, continuous cliff of ice rising more than a mile high and extending across almost the entire width of North America from the east coast to the west coast, marks the southernmost extent of the ice cap in these parts. Elsewhere, it stretched out its lobes and tongues a few tens of miles further south. But here, just short of the outer rim of Serpent Mound crater, the advance was decisively stopped. If humans had been present in Adams County 21,000 years ago to witness the phenomenon, what would they have made of it? Would they have thought this sudden halt of the march of the ice cliffs was random? Just one of those things that happen? Or might it have seemed that some great Manitou protected this land? Let's get back in our time machine. I'm going to set it to stay in the same location, but to jump 8,000 years forward to a midsummer's day, 13,000 years ago, just a couple of hundred years before the onset of the Late Pleistocene Extinction Event. The first thing you'll notice as we step out onto the ridge is that the world is warmer. Indeed, it has been warming steadily since about 18,000 years ago, and particularly dramatically since 14,500 years ago. In consequence, although it is still a giant force of nature, the ice cap has receded about 600 miles to the latitude of Lake Superior, and those looming ice cliffs that formed a massive artificial horizon just 12 miles north of Serpent Mound are completely gone. Minus the roads and telecommunication cables, therefore, the view that confronts us at midsummer 13,000 years ago is pretty much the same as the view at midsummer today, where the natural horizon encircling the effigy is formed by broken and eroded ranges of low hills, themselves the remnants of the ancient hypervelocity cosmic impact that created this unique landscape. So, a timeline for time travelers. 300 million years ago, or thereabouts, a giant cataclysm forms the Serpent Mound crater. 21,000 years ago, The North American ice cap reaches the southernmost point of its advance, stopping just a few miles north of the eroded crater rim. By 13,000 years ago, the ice cliffs are gone, and Serpent Mound's natural horizon has been restored. On June 17, 2017, I made my first research trip to Serpent Mound, reported in Chapter 1, and on June 20th, Midsummer's Eve, Santha, Ross Hamilton and I returned to the site to fly the drone again and to observe sunset over the effigy from the viewpoint of the gods. A matter of perspective. Midsummer, the summer solstice, is the longest day of the year, presently June 20th to 21st in the Northern Hemisphere, when the sun rises at the farthest point north of east and sets at the farthest point north of west on its annual journey. It is also a particularly significant day at Serpent Mound, for it is on the summer solstice that the open jaws of the serpent most directly confront the setting point of the sun, as though about to engulf it. This is because the northern end of the ridge, which Squire and Davis believed had been terraformed, artificially cut as we saw in the last chapter, terminates in a pronounced turn to the west that defines the orientation of the serpent's head. It seems implausible, whoever they may have been, and whenever they first conceived of the mound, open questions as we shall see, that the ancient builders were unaware that this natural westward curve aligned the leading edge of the ridge with the point of sunset on the summer solstice. I believe they were acutely aware of it. Indeed, the presence of the serpent here and the orientation of its head bear all the hallmarks of great minds at work, manifesting a carefully thought-out design, not meant to stand alone, but rather to enhance and elucidate the solstice alignment, the sacred communion of earth and sky that nature had already put in place. From the perspective of 21st century science, the fact that the end of a natural ridge is oriented toward the summer solstice sunset is a matter of chance. It would be foolish to invest it with any significance, let alone with so much significance that it could motivate a huge construction project and bring it to triumphant completion. We should keep in mind, however, that matters seemed very different to the ancients, who perceived the earth and sky as living spirits in communion with one another. In our century, when technology is king and the majority of the human race live and die in cities, we cut down rainforests, pollute and defile the earth, and shun and scrape the sky. Serried blades of immense buildings dice our view of the horizon into jagged, glittering, meaningless origami, while light pollution is so intense that we cannot see the stars. Ironically, however, any number of astronomy programs will bring those stars flickering into virtual reality on our computer screens. Ironically, too, ours is a culture that has advanced the scientific study of the cosmos to an exceptionally high degree. It seems we want to see everything, but only at a distance, through a technological filter. Little wonder, therefore, that for so many of us, the sky has entirely lost the numinous aura that once clung about it, and has been reduced to a vague, out-of-focus, largely irrelevant, not even beautiful background to the much more important material business of our daily lives. Reared in a culture that focuses all its energies on the production and consumption of commercial goods and services, it just looks to us like bad business to commit huge resources, intelligence, and energy to building great monuments aligned, for example, to the rising or setting points of the sun on the equinoxes or on the summer or winter solstices. Yet, for thousands upon thousands of years, this is exactly what happened all around the world. Where heaven and earth meet. Go to the city of Luxor, in Upper Egypt. Place yourself at the western entrance of the great temple of Karnak, in the pre-dawn, on December 20th to 21st, the winter solstice and shortest day of the year in the Northern Hemisphere, and wait patiently until the sun appears. When it does, you will see that its first rays shine directly down the kilometer-long axis of the temple that is oriented south of east at precisely the correct angle to target the rising point of the sun on that special day. Or go to Stonehenge in the pre-dawn on June 20th, 21st, the summer solstice. Enter the Great Stone Circle and face north of east along its axis towards a rough, unquarried megalith, the heel stone, standing prominently outside the circle. As light floods the sky, you will see how carefully and purposefully the heel stone seems to have been placed, almost like the front sight on the barrel of a rifle, to target the rising sun on that special day. Or go to Angkor Wat in Cambodia and position yourself dead center at the western end of the entrance causeway of the Great Temple Complex in the pre-dawn on March 20th, 21st, the spring equinox, or on September 20th, 21st, the autumn equinox, when night and day are of equal length and the sun rises perfectly due east. On either of these two special occasions, you will discover that the causeway and temple are so precisely oriented that the sun, as it rises, perches for a moment atop Angkor's central tower and lights up the entire majestic complex, like a fairy tale kingdom. All these places are man-made sanctuaries that speak to the union of heaven and earth at key moments of the year. They might rightly be described as hierophanies, because their fundamental purpose is to reveal and manifest the sacred connection between macrocosm and microcosm, sky and ground, above and below. Scattered around this majestic garden planet we call Earth, however, are other, even more powerful hierophanies, put in place not by human beings, but by nature, where ground and sky whisper to one another with exceptional intimacy. Wise ancients who knew the garden long before us sought out such spots which they held to be sacred, and when they found them, they would sometimes modify them to honor and enhance the communion witnessed there. Research published in 2018, though subject to further confirmation, suggests that Stonehenge may have been one of them. Archaeologists have long believed that its taller, heftier pillars, the big limestone sarsens, did not occur locally on Salisbury Plain, where Stonehenge stands, but had to be dragged 18 miles from the Marlborough Downs. The enduring mystery, therefore, was why anyone would go through all that trouble and effort, moving megaliths weighing up to 50 tons to Salisbury Plain, when Stonehenge could simply have been erected on the Marlborough Downs instead. The new research offers a rather surprising answer. It seems that two of the sarsens, Stone 16 in the southwestern quadrant of the Great Circle, and the heel stone outside the circle to its northeast, were not, after all, brought here from the Marlborough Downs, but have stood naturally on Salisbury Plain for millions of years. What's magical about them, however, is their alignment. An observer behind Stone 16, looking northeast towards the heel stone at dawn on the summer solstice, will see the sun rise behind it. Then 6 months later, at the winter solstice, an observer behind the heel stone looking southwest at Stone 16 will see the sun set behind it. Archaeologist Mike Pitts, who led the research, suggests that the way the alignment of these two sarsens signaled midwinter and midsummer would not have gone unnoticed by the ancient Britons, who would have accorded special significance to the site long before they planned the geometry of Stonehenge and raised up the whole spectacular complex of megaliths around the pre-existing axis. Indeed, if Pitts is right, it is because of this natural solstice axis that Stonehenge was built here in the first place. Another example of humans sacralizing a place where earth speaks to sky is the Great Sphinx of Giza in Egypt, which is thought to have begun life as a yardang, a ridge of bedrock shaped by millennia of desert winds into a completely natural form, somewhat resembling a lion. Many such outcrops, described by European explorers of the 18th and 19th centuries as sphinx-like and as resembling lions, exist in Egypt's western desert. But what was special about this one was its situation overlooking the Nile Valley, and the curious fact that nature had oriented it with considerable precision to due east and thus to the rising point of the sun on the equinoxes. As suggested at Stonehenge, it looks like this celestial alignment is what attracted human beings to it in the first place, motivating them to transform it into a giant monolithic work of sculpture, first enhancing its naturally leonine form, and much later, in the time of the pharaohs, recarving its by then heavily eroded leonine head into a human likeness. Go to Giza at dawn on the winter solstice, and you will see the sun rising far to the south of east, and thus far to the right of the gaze of the Sphinx. Go there at dawn on the summer solstice, and you will see the sun rising far to the north of east, and thus far to the left of the gaze of the Sphinx. But go there at dawn, on either the spring or the autumn equinox, and you will witness the sacred communion of heaven and earth with the gaze of the Sphinx perfectly aligned to the disk of the sun as it rises. Such enchanted but fleeting conjunctions of earth and sky are not confined to the Old World. In the New World, Native Americans likewise built immense structures to honor and channel precisely the same moments and energies, and sought out certain striking topographical features regarded as sacred through which the celestial and terrestrial spirits were already bound in intimacy. Thus, just as Egypt has its great Sphinx, natural but modified and enhanced by humans to bind sky and ground at sunrise on the equinoxes, and just as the natural solstitial axis of Stonehenge has been modified and enhanced by humans with numinous and beautiful effect, so North America has its great Serpent Mound, a natural ridge, modified and enhanced by humans to join heaven and earth at sunset on the summer solstice. Here comes the sun. Serpent Mound's striking connection to the summer solstice went unnoticed, unobserved, and unstudied by anyone in our era until 1987. That was the year in which the fall issue of the Ohio Archaeologist published a landmark paper by Clark and Marjorie Hardman titled The Great Serpent and the Sun. In this paper, the ridge behind which the sun sets on June 20th, 21st, as viewed from Serpent Mound, was daringly renamed Solstice Ridge by the authors, and the orientation of the open jaws of the serpent to the setting point of the sun on the summer solstice was recognized and made explicit for the first time. What has been seen cannot be unseen, even in an age so radically disconnected from the cosmos as our own. Thanks to the Hardmans, therefore, no one who takes a serious look at Serpent Mound can now fail to observe the way the serpent's jaws line up to the setting summer solstice sun. Because those jaws gape wide, however, it's an alignment that would have been as general and obvious 13,000 years ago as it is today. The Hardmans therefore sought to refine it. They selected as their viewpoint the reported location near the center of the oval formation in front of the serpent's head of the former elevation of large stones, described by Squire and Davis as destroyed when they first visited the site in the mid-19th century. The Hardmans argued that an observer who positioned himself in this location on the evening of the summer solstice would see the sun set at an azimuth of 302 degrees behind a specific feature on Solstice Ridge, a feature something like the front sight on a rifle that they nominated Solstice Knob. Roasting the Hardmans. It's often the case in archaeological scholarship, and actually good science, that whenever an adventurous and unusual new thesis is published, attempts will be made to falsify it. It was therefore only to be expected, as I turned to the winter 1987 issue of Ohio Archaeologist, that I would find a refutation of the Hardmans' work. Titled Serpent Mound Revisited, the paper was written by William F. Romaine, a very interesting and important researcher in this field. On the assumption that Serpent Mound had been built around 2,000 years ago, the consensus archaeological opinion in the 1980s, Romaine pointed out that the Hardmans' proposed alignment had failed to take into account a well-established archaeoastronomical phenomenon, namely that the sun's rising and setting points along the horizon do not remain fixed, but slowly change down the ages. This happens because sunrise and sunset positions are constrained not only by the latitude from which they are observed, but also by the tilt of the Earth's axis in relation to the plane of its orbit. Presently, the angle of the tilt stands at around 23 degrees 44 minutes. This angle, however, is not fixed, but slowly increases and decreases in a 41,000-year obliquity cycle between a minimum of 22.1 degrees and a maximum of 22.5 degrees. The resulting changes to sunrise and sunset positions along the horizon over long periods are sizable, according to leading archaeoastronomer Anthony F. Aveni, whose calculations Romain used in his 1987 paper to highlight what he believed was the fatal flaw in the Hardman's case. They had accepted the epoch of 2,000 years ago for the construction of Serpent Mound, but their proposed sunset azimuth of 302 degrees made no sense. Viewed from Serpent Mound 2,000 years ago, as Romain correctly pointed out, the summer solstice sun would have set at an azimuth of about 300.4 degrees. In other words, the summer solstice sun would have set roughly 1.6 degrees, the equivalent of 3 sun diameters, south of Solstice Knob. If Serpent Mound really was that far out of alignment 2,000 years ago, when it was supposed to have been built, then only 4 logical conclusions presented themselves. 1. Its builders were very poor astronomers. 2. They hadn't intended to orient the monument to the summer solstice sunset at all. 3. The Hardmans were right in their general thesis, but had gotten the proposed observation point and sight line wrong. Or 4. The alignment had not been made 2,000 years ago, but at a completely different time. In another paper published in the Ohio Archaeologist a year later, Robert Fletcher and Terry Cameron picked up where Romain had left off in a renewed roasting of the Hardmans. Noting that the summer solstice sun, as viewed from Serpent Mound, currently sets at azimuth 300 degrees 05 minutes, and noting the effects of the obliquity cycle, they treat with sarcasm the Hardman's claim that the serpent's primary orientation was to azimuth 302 degrees. If a horizon marker at 302 degrees was used at one time to mark the summer solstice sunset position, the serpent, by implication, must have been constructed around 11,000 BC. There may be some who would have problems with that date. It's the last line that reveals the scorn. You bet there would have been some in 1988 who would have had problems with that date. Indeed, not just some, but all archaeologists would have regarded it as the province of the lunatic fringe to suggest that Serpent Mound might in any way go back as far as 11,000 BC, that is, to around 13,000 years ago. In the 1980s, as we'll see in Part 2, there was a general acceptance that humans might have first arrived in the Americas by 12,000 or even 13,000 years ago. But those earliest migrants were deemed by archaeologists to have been scattered hunter-gatherer groups living from hand to mouth and lacking the vision, sophistication, and level of organization required to create a monument on the scale of Serpent Mound. The real implication of the Hardman's error, the clue they'd inadvertently stumbled upon of possibly much more ancient origins for the site, was therefore never followed up, because the prevailing theory of the peopling of the Americas would not admit it as evidence. Meanwhile, as the years passed, William Romain changed his mind. In 1987, he had written in his critique of the Hardmans that the orientation of Serpent Mound could be better explained by a set of facts having nothing to do with the summer solstice. By the year 2000, however, he was ready to accept as unequivocal an alignment with the head of the serpent through the oval embankment to the summer solstice sunset, and showed in a map how this could be done to target azimuth 300.4 degrees, later revised to azimuth 300.1 degrees, where the summer solstice sun would have set 2,000 years ago. He also reiterated the definitive north-south line he'd identified in 1987, running through the monument from the inner spiral of its tail to the hinge of its jaws. But is the serpent really 2,000 years old? Back in the 1980s, when Romain first laid into the Hardmans, The one thing both sides agreed on was that Serpent Mound was about 2,000 years old and was one of the later works of the Adena, a Native American culture thought to have flourished between approximately 800 BC and AD 100. Though no carbon dating had been done, this was the consensus view of almost all experts at the time. And Romain and the Hardmans not only accepted it without question, but also used it as the basis for their own calculations of alignments. Imagine their surprise, therefore, when Robert Fletcher of the University of Pittsburgh, one of the early critics of the Hardmans, William Pickard of Ohio State University, and Bradley T. Lepper of the Ohio Historical Society carried out the first carbon dating of Serpent Mound and found it to be much younger than everyone had supposed, not 2,000 years old or more, but 1,000 years old or less. To be precise, they concluded that the most likely date for its construction was 920 years, plus or minus 70 years, before the present, and that it must therefore be the work of the so-called Fort Ancient culture, thought to have flourished at around that time. Published in spring 1996 in a respected peer-reviewed journal, this notion of a much younger Serpent Mound went on to enjoy a level of widespread acceptance among American archaeologists that would certainly not have been accorded to it if the redating had gone in the other direction. Moreover, after being quickly and uncritically adopted into doctrine, it was then disseminated to the public for most of the next 20 years as unquestioned historical fact. As part of this process, an Orwellian scene took place at Serpent Mound in 2003, when the official Ohio historical marker that had previously attributed the monument to the Adena culture was unhappened, and replaced by another in which visitors were informed that the earthwork had been built around 1000 AD by the Fort Ancient culture. Let's take a look at the evidence on which Fletcher, Pickard, and Lepper based the 1996 claim that so effectively redefined Serpent Mound. Part of it has to do with an absence of evidence of typical Adena cultural artifacts, indeed an absence of any artifacts, in those parts of the serpent excavated prior to the 1990s. As Fletcher and co. rightly point out, it was only because a number of definite Adena burial mounds had been found nearby that Serpent Mound had been attributed to the Adena in the first place, an attribution that was therefore somewhat tenuous. As to the positive evidence for their claim, Fletcher and co. give special prominence to stone flakes and tools uncovered by their excavations at Serpent Mound, including a classic Fort Ancient Madison Point. They also recovered 29 pottery shards, assignable to some period between AD 350 and 950. Finally, and clearly the clincher as far as they're concerned, they list the radiocarbon dates for 3 samples of charcoal retrieved during their excavations. One, with a date of 2,920 plus or minus 65 years before the present, they immediately dismiss because it came from a level far below the estimated original surface upon which Serpent Mound was built. But the other 2 they like. Both were recovered from the intact sediment used to create the effigy, and both returned the same calibrated radiocarbon date of AD 1070. These 2 identical dates, Fletcher, Pickard, and Lepper conclude, represent valid chronological evidence for the construction of Serpent Mound sometime during the late prehistoric or early Fort Ancient periods. Lepper even speculates, he does admit it's a speculation, that the serpent was made in response to the passage of Halley's Comet in 1066, recorded elsewhere as far afield as Europe and China. It was a spectacular, fiery display, and it seems to me it's more than possible that the Native Americans may have viewed Halley's Comet as a serpent snaking across the sky. It's possible they looked up at it and recorded it as an omen and built the serpent. And that's it. With a wave of the archaeologist's magic wand, a fairy tale castle of speculation is conjured into being on the foundations of just 2 tiny fragments of charcoal. In the process, while being rendered less old, less venerable, and less mysterious, the sublime artistry, astronomy, geometry, and imagination expressed in Serpent Mound are snatched from one culture and handed to another by the so-called experts of a third. Skin changer. North American archaeology has a long track record of wanting Native American sites to be young, as we'll see in Part 2. In the case of Serpent Mound, however, there were some archaeologists, notable among them William Romaine, who were never happy with the somewhat tenuous nature of the evidence on which Fletcher, Pickard, and Lepper had built their castle in the sky. As Romaine tactfully put it in 2011, since the charcoal that was dated did not come from a foundation feature or event, the AD 1070 date may not reflect when the effigy was actually constructed. Soon afterward, Romaine followed up his hunch by joining forces with a multidisciplinary team of fellow researchers to re-evaluate when and how Serpent Mound was built. It was a thorough, professional, long-term project, deploying the latest technologies and involving fresh excavations, core sampling, and multiple radiocarbon dates. The results, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in October 2014, thoroughly ripped the rug out from under the comfortable consensus of the previous 18 years that the serpent was around 900 or 1,000 years old and was the work of the Fort Ancient culture. We believe that, taken as a whole, Romaine and his colleagues reported, our data strongly support that Serpent Mound was first constructed around 2,300 years ago, rather than around 1,400 years later. Our results indicate the presence of a pre-construction paleosol beneath Serpent Mound, and that charcoal from different locales along its surface dates consistently to around 300 BC. The youngest calibrated age within the 95% probability range is 116 BC, and we obtained no dates associated with the later Fort Ancient occupation of the site. Charitably, however, there was no crowing in triumph, no pouring of scorn on Fletcher, Lepper, and Pickard. Instead, Romaine's team saw the real answer in a compromise. The evidence compiled by Fletcher et al. Concerning the reliability of their carbon-14 ages is generally convincing and supports the charcoal as authentically related to a Fort Ancient reconstruction episode 900 years ago, which leaves the contradiction between the two initial construction chronologies unresolved. To settle this contradiction, we propose that Serpent Mound was constructed and then later modified during two distinct episodes: an Edina construction around 2,300 years ago, during which the mound was first built, followed around 1,400 years later by an episode of Fort Ancient renovation or repair. Because their work was well done, their evidence solid, and their arguments compelling, but also because their redating was more of a return to the pre-1996 consensus than anything dangerously new or radical, the model proposed by Romaine and his colleagues has subsequently displaced Fletcher et al. Serpent Mound has been returned to the Edina, and despite some unpersuasive protests from Bradley Lepper and incomplete information foisted on the public at the site itself, few today would seriously attempt to argue that it is less than 2,300 years old. The lingering question, though, is, could it be older? Perhaps very much older. After all, is it not the defining quality of the serpent that from time to time it sheds its skin? And is it not precisely on account of this that it served for many ancient cultures as a symbol of reincarnation? It is therefore reasonable to ask how often Serpent Mound has shed its skin and renewed itself. The 1996 and 2014 studies taken together provide solid evidence of a change of skin around 900 years ago, a renovation project. However, largely because of the pre-construction paleosol, that's a soil stratum laid down in an earlier age, forming the foundation of the mound, it is taken for granted that the earlier episode at 2,300 years ago was the birth of the project. Setting aside the one anomalous charcoal fragment dated to 2,920 years ago in the 1996 study, and the two fragments testifying to the Fort Ancient renovation, all the datable materials from the 2014 study, which clustered around 300 BC as we've seen, were found above this bed of ancient soil. The sub-mound Paleosol was buried, the archaeologists therefore conclude, and Serpent Mound construction began 2,300 years ago during the early woodland Adena period. It seems like a reasonable argument, but it leaves another possibility unconsidered, namely that 2,300 years ago, Serpent Mound was already an enormously ancient structure, perhaps very much eroded and damaged, and that it was cleared down to the level of the Paleosol and remade by the Adena culture at this time. In that case, the archaeologists behind the 2014 study would not have documented the birth of the serpent, but its rebirth or reincarnation. Why not? The 2014 study did not gather the necessary data to confirm whether the mound was in continuous use from the Adena period 2,300 years ago until the Fort Ancient renovations 1,400 years later. However, a possible erased coil near the head of the serpent indicates that other alterations, potentially several hundred years earlier than the Fort Ancient repairs, may also have occurred. This suggests a deeper, richer, and far more complex history for Serpent Mound than previously known. Again, why should this deeper, richer, far more complex history be limited to the relatively recent past? Since Romain and his co-authors are prepared to consider the possibility that Serpent Mound was regularly used, repaired, and possibly reconfigured by local groups for more than 2,000 years, then why not for longer? Even Fletcher and Co. admit that their anomalous 2,920-year-old piece of charcoal and nearby Adena burial mounds are evidence of the use of the area during the early woodland period. But why should such use have been ephemeral, as they assert? Why shouldn't those early woodland peoples also, like later cultures, have been present to tend to, maintain, restore, and sometimes reorient and reconstruct the Great Manitou? If so, and if others who came before them had done the same work in their time, inheriting that sacred responsibility from even earlier cultures, and participating down the millennia in an irregular process of restoration and refurbishment, then the possibility cannot be ruled out that the first incarnation of the effigy might indeed have been in the Ice Age 13,000 years ago. Were that to be confirmed, everything we've been taught about the state of early Native American civilizations and the global timeline of prehistory would have to be rethought.